Hi, everybody. This is a review of some of the things that we talked about this week, primarily from chapter four. Uh, and I want you to keep in mind that this is really a brief review. This is actually my third time trying to do this, and I end up going too in depth. So, just a little warning: I'm going to be going very quickly, just a brief review, and is no substitute for reading and studying. But with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the French and Indian War and how important the French and Indian War is to American history for a number of reasons. When we talk about the French and Indian War, I always like to show a map of this area right here. If you are a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, they play football right around here. And this is what is today is known as Pittsburgh. And this is going to be where the French and Indian War gets its start. And if we go to a bigger map here, this one's a little blurry, but you get an idea when you look at the area that I was just at. You can see the incredibly important geography of this area, that it's connected by rivers. It's an essentially located area. And as we're going to see, the French and Indian War is going to be primarily over this area known as the Ohio River Valley. So let's talk about the causes of the French and Indian War, and I'm just going to go ahead here a little bit. The causes of the French and Indian War were actually a part of a larger war, sometimes referred to as the 7 Years' War. And in terms of American history, it was between the French and the Indians, who were together. Sometimes kids misunderstand that. They think they were fighting each other. But the French and the Indians were together fighting against the American colonists and Britain. What were they fighting over? The Ohio River Valley, and sometimes I say nothing short than dominance of North America. We're going to talk about, and certainly it's already been referred to in the DBQ that you're working on this week, is that we see a cameo of sorts of George Washington. And George Washington plays a very important role in the French and Indian War. He is involved in some of the earlier fighting of the French and Indian War. He loses the Battle of Fort Necessity, which interestingly enough happens on the 4th of July. And he gets not only military experience in the French and Indian War, but that military experience is going to become very important. Obviously, spoiler alert, later on in the American Revolution. But he's also going to get a degree of political experience. And it's interesting, if George Washington did nothing else, there might be a sentence about him in regards to the French and Indian War, but obviously he's going to become very important later on. The Albany Plan of Union. This political cartoon is probably one of the most famous political cartoons in American history. It was done by Benjamin Franklin, and it was done in support of the Albany Plan of Union. Because it's so famous, you might mistakenly believe that it was successful. It was a failure. Its intent was to encourage the colonies to unify and join this Albany Plan of Union. They did not. They refused. It was also wrong, because the point here is join or we will die, join or this is going to be a catastrophe. And clearly it wasn't. The American colonists did not unify, and everything worked out just fine in the French and Indian War. The Americans and Britain were able to win. Having said that, the bigger theme here is unity, and this is going to be a theme that we're going to talk about throughout American history. The lack of unity, the struggle for unity, the waxing and waning of Americans being unified at some moments and then less unified in others, and that continues to this day. But this is an early example of Americans attempting to unify, and that attempt not working out very well. Let's talk about the war itself. Oftentimes in this class, we're going to go through the war quickly. That's just the nature of a survey class. The Battle of Quebec is going to be the pivotal battle in the French and Indian War. General Wolfe is going to win the Battle of Quebec, and he's also going to die there. One of the most important battles in the history of the world, because it has such an impact on the future of not only American history, but subsequently world history. The Peace of Paris is going to give England and the American colonists all of the land west of the Mississippi River, and we have English supremacy in the North American continent. Now, what's interesting about this, and I'll have to be quick here, is that oftentimes we think, oh, this is great, this is wonderful, now we've gotten rid of the French, we've limited the power of Native Americans, this is going to be great. It's going to have unforeseen consequences. Now that England and it only has to worry about the American colonists, they're going to pay more attention to the American colonists, and that attention is not going to be well received. On the American side, the Americans took great pride in the role that they played in the French and Indian War and are going to demand and believe that they should have more rights, especially in light of the role that they played in the French and Indian War. The results of the war. Well, England is now in the Americas. Salutary neglect, benign neglect, a lot of that came from England not wanting to put forth the effort or the expense of regulating the colonists. It's cheaper to let them get involved in smuggling. It's cheaper to allow them to have their own self-government. But now that the French and Indian War is going on and shortly over, the troops are going to be here to stay. The British troops come to the North American colonies and they stay. They have to be paid for. The British government believes that should be done by the Americans. Obviously, the Americans are going to disagree with that. There's an interesting way that these two sides look at this war. The British look at the Americans as spoiled brats. The British look at the Americans as undisciplined rabble. The Americans, you know, in traditional American way, have tremendous pride in the role that they played in the French and Indian War. This view of how the Americans acted in the war, this differing view, is going to have a big effect on the relationship between England and her American colonies. The Native Americans, which were kind of left in the lurch here, the French lost and they abandoned their Native American allies. The Native Americans are going to rebel, a very famous Native American rebellion. That's interesting. I don't know why that happened. Let's see here. Let's go back to this screen, and I apologize for that. The Native Americans rebel, and something known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac's Rebellion is important for a number of reasons. It's an important early Native American rebellion. It shows that Native Americans were fighting for their land. Native Americans were given blankets that had been used by people who had smallpox, and some people talk about it as an early example of germ warfare. But most importantly, for our purposes, the Pontiac's Rebellion is going to be important because it led to the Proclamation of 1763. That may have gotten a little cut off on your screen, but the Proclamation of 1763, talk about differing perspectives. The English issued the Proclamation of 1763 with an intent of keeping American colonists and Native Americans isolated from one another. So it said that the Americans could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. This map does a good job showing that. Americans, however, viewed this as a real insult. You know, they had fought, they had died in the French and Indian War, and now they wanted the spoils of that war. They wanted the land. This is an incredibly important date. And one of the most common questions that kids say is, do we have to know dates, Mr. Sherman? I always say, no, 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 no. There's only a handful of dates that I have you know. And just to illustrate how important this is one of them. 1763 is a turning point. Before 1763, Americans have great pride as being part of the British Empire. After 1763, it's going to be what I refer to as the beginning of dissent. Americans start to have a problem with being part of the British Empire for a number of reasons. And all you have to do is a little math here. 13 years later, we have another very important date, 1776. And I think we all know what that refers to. All right, time is ticking here. The British actions. Britain starts to enforce the Navigation Acts. These laws had always been on the books, but because of benign neglect, they weren't enforced. Britain starts to list, enumerated, they start to list a number of goods that can only be traded with England, and they begin to enforce these laws more stringently than they have ever had before. They pass a number of taxes, the Sugar Act, the hat tax, for example. And these things are important, but more importantly is how they administer justice. The Admiralty courts, we're familiar with this idea of burden of proof, and everyone's kind of familiar with the sing-songy idea that you are innocent until proven guilty. Where that comes from is actually the enforcement of the Sugar Acts way back in the colonial era. The Admiralty courts said you had the burden of proof. you had to prove that you were not guilty. And obviously, after the American Revolution, the founding fathers are going to be influenced by that when they write the Constitution. But by far, the most important tax that was passed was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was a direct tax. You had to get a stamp on certain goods, mostly paper goods. A lot of times kids think this has to do with mail. It has nothing to do with mail. It's a physical stamp, a proof that you paid the tax. And it was a direct tax, so you had to go to a window to get the stamp. It was very much in your face. This is going to be incredibly important. And of all the things that unify Americans, eventually it's going to be the Stamp Act that will unify Americans. Very quickly, the Committee of Correspondence. Today, I say we might use Twitter or Facebook to talk about things that we're upset about. Some of the rebellions in the Middle East, known as the Arab Spring, had used Facebook and Twitter for those reasons. Of course, they don't have that back then. Sam Adams writes letters. I don't know if you've ever used the phrase correspond with someone, but it's writing letters. And he'd write letters to unify and inform other colonies, especially other colonies, because so much of this discontent was happening in New England. Sam Adams was behind a lot of the Sons of Liberty. When we talk about tarring and feathering, he kept alive opposition. Hancock was one of the richest men in the colonies, so this was a great little quote. They would say, Hancock paid the postage and Adams penned the letters. The penman of the revolution, which we'll talk about later. Talking about tarring and feathering, these are some powerful images. Tarring and feathering is just a brutal practice. You can see that they're shoving the tea down their throat, pulling the hair, the Liberty Tree with a noose in the background. Here's another image that evokes a lot of the same ideas here. As I said earlier, nothing unites the American colonists until the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act Congress was the first unified legislative body that included all the colonies. They put forth a system of boycotts that are incredibly effective. It encourages homespun garments, so people start making things at home. They're no longer importing from England. And economically, England was importing a quarter of all their exports to America. So this was very, very harsh for the English to deal with. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty were groups that were both above board and below board. They were engaged in legal activities and illegal activities like tarring and feathering. Violence we've talked about. And the Declaratory Act, the Stamp Act Congress and boycotts especially were so successful that the king passed the Declaratory Act. He declared, that's where the name comes from, that he has the right to tax Americans, but he's going to repeal the Stamp Act. So he repealed the Stamp Act, but in doing so, he strongly declared that he had the right to still tax Americans. I put this as a reminder to myself to tell the story. The Americans pulled down his statue and melted it and turned the statue into musket balls. I think that's a great story, right? This guy's a very arrogant guy. Champagne Charlie Townshend is his nickname, and he famously said he's going to pluck the feathers from the colonial goose with a minimum of squawking. So he said he was going to tax the Americans and they wouldn't even complain about it. With that in mind, the time is running short here, so I'm going to wrap it up, but he taxed a number of things, most famously tea, and we'll talk about that later. And he also issued something known as the writs of assistance, which were general search warrants. So he could search anyone, anytime, anywhere in the American colonists. Again, we see how influential this idea is when the Founding Fathers will later write the Constitution. The penman of the Revolution, John Dickinson. He's not as famous as some of the others, but I don't know why. He really is incredibly important. He's often credited with this idea, no taxation without representation, which becomes the rallying cry for the colonists. And he's most famous for writing the letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. We will talk more about virtual representation. I'm going to skip that right now. Some violent acts was the burning down of the Gaspee. This was a famous British ship that had arrested a lot of smugglers. It ran aground on a sandbar and a bunch of Americans went out and burned it down. Very important incident that for whatever reason isn't well known now. More famously is the Boston Tea Party. Well, seconds are ticking by. This was a good review for you for this week. Good luck on your quiz tomorrow.